In tonight's episode, we cover 5 hair-raising encounters with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and what others believe to be some wild beast in the wilderness. From footprints found in the wintertime to having rocks and logs thrown at you, let the encounters begin. Story 1. Born and raised in Oklahoma, and have been my whole life. I grew up fishing, tracking, everything you could possibly want to do in the outdoors. My entire family is that way, and I raise my boys the same way. However, I've never been one to believe in all of the silly fairy tales that people spew about Bigfoot and other silly animals that live in the woods and apparently exist. Until one day, me and my oldest son had a strange encounter when we went to go fishing at one of our local creeks we like to frequent. It was a beautiful sunny day in June of '99, and we thought we'd make a good day of it and go pack some food and have a good day fishing, just father and son. Well, we got everything loaded up and got the tackle box and our poles and headed out. The creek we were heading to is roughly about 20 minutes away from our house, since we kind of live a little bit out of town. When we got to the creek, all seemed well and lively. The water was rushing pretty quick. Even though it was June, the stream was still ice cold, which is always great to stick your feet into just after getting there and you've been walking around and it's very hot. This particular spot, it's a pretty typical creek bed, but there is a lot of bushes and brush scattered throughout the area, and I'm talking tall bushes that are like 6 to 7 feet tall. It's definitely not clear and open, so you have to kind of find a nice spot along the riverbank to fish. We found a nice spot to sit down, and we began to unpack our food and get our tackle box and poles all set up. As I'm sitting there helping my son, I noticed my son's attention is not on what we're doing. Instead, he's looking over my shoulder with the most confused look on his face, seeming quite distracted. I thought that was pretty odd since my son's favorite pastime is fishing, and I never lose his attention to anything other than fishing. So I turned my head to see what he's looking at, and I think maybe it's a bear or something, but I was wrong. About 30 feet away, behind a 5-foot bush, was this face peeking out, staring at both of us. It looked humanoid, but also had a very Neanderthal-like quality to it, with hair all around it, and more of a cone-shaped kind of head. The cheeks were bare, and the skin looked very leathery, but there was hair all over the face. The eyes were dark, and I couldn't really make out any pupils. Its nose was like ours, not like a gorilla's. I wasn't really sure what it was at first. Once it realized both of us were staring at it, it immediately popped its head back down. My son starts freaking out, wondering what on earth it was looking at us. I was starting to freak out a little bit too, but I just wanted to chalk it up to somebody playing a cheap trick on us with some sort of stupid Hollywood mask. So I yelled out, "Whoever you are, leave now. I have a gun on me." And this thing, faster than I could have ever imagined, bolted out from behind this bush into the woodline about another 70 to 80 feet. Now, I want to remind you that this is total daylight, so we're able to see everything pretty clearly. This thing was about 5 to 6 feet tall and pretty hairy. I mean, I'm talking full black hair. If a black bear could be walking on 2 legs and running like a human could, you would pretty much be nailing it, except for the cone-shaped head and no neck. It didn't really look like it had much of a neck, and its arms swayed back and forth. It was also very barrel body shaped and built like a tank. It never looked back as it ran, and I've never seen anyone or anything run so fast. As soon as it hit the woodline, it disappeared. My son, for the rest of the day, kept wondering what on earth it was that we saw. I told him that we would talk about it later, and to try and just enjoy our fishing trip. Well, we didn't really fish there for long before he was just too uncomfortable, and so we left to go back home. On the drive home, my son is in a stupor and he asks me, "Did we see a Bigfoot?" I told him that Bigfoot isn't real and it must have just been somebody trying to pull a prank on us. Looking back, I was really naive to think that. I've told this encounter to a couple of friends of mine who are Bigfoot enthusiasts, and they informed me that what I probably experienced was a juvenile Bigfoot, since it appeared a lot more curious and playful than it ever did territorial or aggressive in any way. I'm not really freaked out now, but whatever it was very strange. I felt weird for me and my son seeing what it was. Now that my son is all grown up, he still goes fishing in that exact same spot, but we've never really talked about the experience since, and I've never brought it back up. Story 2. This is a story that my grandfather had told me back from when he was younger. He's had property in his generation for a long time, and him and his father used to hunt on their property out in Texas. As of currently, our family had moved to Minnesota, and that is where we've been currently residing for a long time. We actually don't even visit the old property anymore, and haven't in ages. My grandfather has been hunting since he was just a boy, and so he's a fairly experienced woodsman who doesn't really ever fear much. It still gives me chills to this day to hear this encounter, because my grandfather still gets shaken up every time he recounts it. My grandfather hunted all sorts of game, deer, coyotes, squirrels, you name it. They had a lot of property to work with, so he had a lot of time on his hands to really learn the woods around him and get a good feel for the game in the area. There's even wild turkey that would run around there from time to time, so there was plenty to hunt all season long. This particular day ended with him taking a route that he didn't normally take to venture out to a different part of the property that he wasn't used to. Him and his father had several different routes they would take on their property to go venture off and different spots to go hunt. After making it maybe a mile is when he started to hear strange vocalizations and other bizarre noises in the woods around him. At first, he told me he thought it was a bird, but he said there's no birds in the woods that sound like these noises did. They would come and go, so he kinda wrote them off at first, but they started getting louder and more frequent. But he kept venturing further because my grandfather isn't afraid of anything. After venturing maybe another mile is when he started to get hit with a very strong skunk musk odor that was said to smell like rotting meat and skunk. My grandfather described it like coming upon a pile of 100 dead rotting skunks just sitting in the sun and baking. He said it was so strong there'd be times it was hard not to want to gag and vomit. He said he kept looking around but didn't see anything, but started to get the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. At this point, he knew something was up. He couldn't find the trace of the smell, and things were getting more eerie as time went on. He also told me that as he ventured around the area, there were times where he would run into stuff that didn't quite look right, like markers that weren't quite man-made, is what he said. Like they might have been markings from animals or something. He told me about how he found smaller trees that were ripped up out of the ground and turned upside down and pulled back into the ground. What's scary is this is back in the 1940s, and their property was pretty large, as well as being private, so nobody was going to be hanging out on their property doing anything like this. And if so, who's going to rip up all these small trees out of the ground? And who's going to have enough strength to drive them back into the ground? This was really unsettling. My grandfather also believes he stumbled upon a small den of whatever it was he was smelling. He said he also found a small cave opening that opened up into a cave that he estimated to be roughly 30 square feet. But the stench of the dead skunk smell was where it was coming from. He also said he could see bones just from the cave entrance alone, and decided it was probably a good idea to head back home. Although they were the bones of deer from what he gathered, he didn't want to take any chances. He told me that as he was leaving the den, he started to get an extremely overwhelming feeling of dread and felt the need to get the hell out of there. That's when he noticed rocks starting to be thrown in his direction. And I'm not talking about little pebbles. I'm talking rocks the size of a tire literally being thrown through the woods about 10 to 20 feet near him. This was obviously enough, so he was so scared he booked it out of there and got back home as fast as he could. He said whatever was throwing those rocks at him had to be incredibly strong, and obviously not a human. He said there was some sort of stomping and screaming noises that were going on as soon as he was leaving the den. Something was trying to drive him out of the area, and whatever it was close by. He tells me there were multiple of these things, not even 50 feet away, but he couldn't see them. After that, he still continues to hunt on his property, but not near as much as he used to, and he never went beyond where he went before. He continued to stay in new areas. His father never said much about it, and I guess there was never really a whole lot to discuss, since back then especially, you'd be practically crazy if you ever brought it up. The property ended up getting passed down to him once his father died, and not long after that, he moved to Minnesota due to his career. Story 3. My fiance and I love camping and always do stuff in the outdoors. We're usually pretty avid hikers and explorers. We've gone through many different trails, hikes, and many adventures out in the woods. I've never noticed anything out of the ordinary or even out of place, although I am a firm believer in the paranormal and Bigfoot and other weird occurrences that do happen, although I've never really experienced them until this particular event that I'm about to talk to you about. Me and my fiance decided to camp at one of our favorite lakes, Lake Dewey in Michigan. We've camped here several times before and have always had a great experience, so this time would be no different, or so we thought. It was later September, and I remember because it was still pretty warm, but the cold crisp in the air of fall had not yet set in. We had a pretty typical fun day on the lake. We hung out, we hiked, we hung out in our tent before going back out and hiking again, and then coming back for dinner to relax for the evening. But by the end of the first night, my boyfriend was acting strange. He was getting really quiet and not talking as much as he normally does, which I just chalked it up to him being exhausted, since we did had a long day. We ended up putting out the fire and turning in for the night. I noticed he seemed on edge and had a rough time falling asleep, but he didn't mention anything, even when I asked him if he was okay. I sacked right out and woke up the next morning no problems, feeling well rested and ready to take on the next day. Him, not so much. He didn't look so good and seemed like he was still on edge from yesterday. After getting up and eating breakfast and going on the next hike, the day seemed pretty normal, and we decided to get ready to go back to camp as it was starting to become later in the afternoon. That's when he set me down and told me that he had been feeling uncomfortable since yesterday. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he didn't feel right about where we were, and that he felt like we were being looked at and watched very closely. I assured him that he was just paranoid, and it was silly to think like that. Nothing was out here. Nothing was going to get us. I convinced him to stay with me another night, but he seemed so apprehensive about it. Now, it was bothering me how weird he was acting, because it's not like him. Usually, he's one of those guys that is the first to come up with crazy hiking trails and spots for us to check out. He was always the first one of us to want to explore dangerous territory and stuff that were never meant to be explored. This night was a little calmer, and I feel like we both checked in a little earlier than normal. I ended up staying up and dinking around on my cell phone while my boyfriend just lay there trying to fall asleep. The evening had been pretty dead. We hadn't really talked a whole lot after heading back to camp. It was just kind of blah. After he sat me down and told me what he did earlier, I had been kind of on edge, but just tried to play it off. It was pretty late at night if I remember right. I want to say my phone said something like 11:32, and this is where we started to hear footsteps go through our campsite. And I mean heavy footsteps. And then the breathing started. I started to feel really uneasy, and I just kept hearing a thud for every step that was taken. I started to panic because I wasn't sure if this was a bear we were dealing with or someone who was trying to hurt us. I looked over to my boyfriend and asked him if he heard what I was hearing, and he was already as white as a ghost and nodded right at me. I sat there scared, looking at the door of my tent, trying to listen for any sound I could. The sound had ceased for a while, and all I heard was the night air. The stomping would stop for a couple of moments, and then it would resume. Whatever it was stomping around in circles around our tent, but it wasn't really getting into any of our stuff like a bear would. It's like it was casing our tent or something. It made me feel so nervous. Whatever it was kept getting really close to the tent, and we could hear it breathing heavily. It must have been huge because it sounded like it was a 10-foot tall man. Either that, or it was a bison on 2 legs walking around our campsite. For the next few hours, this would go on and off until roughly 3 or 4 in the morning, and we could finally fall asleep. We didn't even notice the noises stopping, and the feeling of dread went away. I think my boyfriend and I fell asleep from just sheer exhaustion and panic. We still do not talk about it to this day, and when we got up the next morning, we didn't even speak. We just booked it out of there and packed up as quickly as we could. Could it have been a Bigfoot from what we saw or heard? Probably. Could it have been someone rummaging through our camp? I don't know. Whatever it was, I don't think I'll ever go back to that lake. Story 4. Me and my brother Travis have been going out hunting together for as long as I can remember. Back when my pa, God rest his soul, used to take us when we were little, he always told us how impressed he was because of how quickly we were able to catch on and learn about the area around us and things we would notice like tracks, markings, sounds. It was great. We didn't actually start going hunting though with him until we were a little older, around 9 or 10, and we instantly fell in love with it. Our pa passed away from cancer when we were roughly about 17 and 16 respectively, since my little brother is only about a year and a half younger than I, and it just quite hasn't been the same since. So, to honor that, me and my brother make it a ritual to try and go out together every year and hunt and keep it going. The family line depends on it. Our uncle has had some property that has been passed down for quite a few generations that me and my brother and pa have hunted on for ages. These past 5 years specifically though, we had been going to different places to hunt, and it just wasn't quite the same as our uncle's property. So this year we had decided we were going to go back to our uncle's and give it a go. We contacted him and got the okay, and we'd shown up there in the early morning. Luckily for us, there's several different tree stands set up all throughout my uncle's property. He's got about 80 plus acres of just deep woods. We are in Montana after all, and a really nice cabin-styled house that we sometimes like to sleep in when we visit before we go out camping. Anyway, we knew this time the usual tree stands we wanted to hit. We got there that early morning and got all geared up and ready to go. It was clear my brother was going to take a stand about a half mile away from the stand I was in. We were both going to go in about 2 to 3 miles deep into the woods to get to this one specific spot we both knew of. It was actually a pretty good clearing, and there are many bucks and does that were usually sighted here, so we knew this was the prime spot. We got all ready and headed out to the designated spots we needed to go. I wished my brother luck, and he did to me as well. I climbed up into my tree stand once I made it and sat there and I waited. Usually, When I get to my tree stand, it's hard for me to not want to get totally relaxed and just be comfortable. I love it. I love it being out in nature and hunting. That's where I belong, and I've always felt so at peace. The sunlight was barely breaking through. It couldn't have been any later than 5 or 6 in the morning. I don't remember exactly. I thought it was weird though that I didn't notice any wildlife really teeming in the area as we had made our hike back to these stands. I didn't think anything of it at the time though. An hour had gone by and nothing. The woods were so unusually quiet, and all the life in it was gone. I mean, there wasn't a sign of anything around. I thought it was so odd. It wasn't long after that I started hearing weird noises coming through the woods. I couldn't really place a direction around me to where it was coming from. I just knew it was coming around me from close by. I just figured at first that it was a big buck finally coming through the area since it sounded so heavy. I kept hearing brush crushing and twigs snapping. The only issue is the heavy thudding and footsteps I was hearing didn't sound like it was coming from a 4-footed animal. It sounded like it was a heavy person, but it sounded way too heavy to be a person. I started to hear what I can only describe as whooping-like noises and other strange sounds. I started to get nervous. The sounds began getting louder and louder, and as I looked out of my tree stand to see if I could spot what it was, I locked eyes on it. Coming into the woods from the clearing not even 50 yards away from me was this giant hairy man. I quickly ducked my head down to make sure it didn't see me, and every step it took was a deep thud, and I could hear it wheezing and breathing hard. I heard it walk its way towards me, and then as it approached my stand and got close, it slowed down. I was so terrified I wasn't sure what to do. I gripped my rifle tightly, praying I wouldn't have to use it in this confrontation because I knew I wouldn't make it standing out against this thing. It slowly passed underneath me and kept on going. I waited for it to be gone completely before I even moved a muscle. It felt like an eternity. I quickly opened the hatch and got down out of my stand, and by instinct, I ran to my brother's stand where I knew he'd be. Only being half a mile away, I knew it wouldn't be too far, and if I can get past the thing that walked right under my stand, I would probably be okay. The woods were still quiet, which made me so nervous because that means it was still in the area. I made it to my brother's stand in probably 10 minutes, or even less. He was also as pale as a ghost. I explained to him what had happened, and he didn't really say much. He just said we needed to leave, and so we hightailed it out of there. I've been hunting for years and years, and I've never seen anything or encountered anything like I did that morning. It wasn't until we got back to the truck that my brother was telling me he saw the same thing walking near his tree stand, and that he doesn't believe this creature saw him or even meant any harm. He's probably right, but it's something that I don't want to have happen ever again. It honestly scared me to death, and I haven't been able to go back to my uncle's property and hunt since. My brother was able to get over it and move on, but he will never talk about it. And since then, we found other areas and places to hunt on. I think we've kind of just collectively have decided to not go back, even if it is kind of an unspoken rule. Whatever's running around on my uncle's property, keep it far away from me. Story 5. When I was in my early 20s, I loved going out in the wintertime and exploring as much as I could. It was my favorite season to go out and hike in. Everything was so magical, and even though it was cold, the temperature and climates never pushed me away. Even though most people never went outdoors in that time, I always dressed accordingly. My favorite thing would be to go down old abandoned logging roads and just pull off and start exploring. Usually, those are the best parts because so much of those woods around there are untouched. Of course, I like to really go and explore just about every season there is, but winter is just so unique. I'm not really a hunter by trade or a woodsman. I just like to hike and explore. But I do have many good friends that are avid outdoorsmen and hunters. Now, there is always something to see and explore, no matter really what season you're in. I often take weapons with me, like elephant knives and the such, just in case I would run into a bear or a mountain lion or anything that would put me in a bad situation. In this particular time, as I was exploring the area around, I came across what appeared to be extremely large tracks down by this little frozen river a few miles into the woods. I've always been pretty neutral about the whole Bigfoot phenomena, but this was amazing to witness firsthand. I don't know if really anybody else comes out this way, and if they do, I seriously doubt they're going to bring a fake foot imprint on the ground. This was a dried up old creek bed that looked like it had been not used for a long time, like maybe it had dried up years and years ago, because the footprints looked like they had been old and frozen. I think what really got me was the overall impression of the footprint. You could tell it was set pretty deep into the frozen ground. Now, these footprints weren't exactly in the snow, more so in an area where the snow was receding and the ground was still totally frozen, and it looked like the footprints had been there prior to snowfall. You can tell that whatever made this footprint, or these footprints, must have been extremely heavy. The footprints had easily been 16 inches or more, and were only faded a little bit, so they were pretty well preserved, but I think that was due to the cold, frigid temps. It was interesting to note that there were 5 clearly defined toes in the footprint, as well as no real arch. It was clearly a bipedal footprint I was looking at. The footprints loosely were around the riverbank and went into the direction of the woods. What's even crazier is the stride. The stride between the footprints was roughly 5 to 6 feet. What on earth would have that kind of stride out here? I didn't really feel like even trying to figure out what it could be. I thought about following the footprints, but I immediately considered that being a bad idea, just because 1, I don't know what animal made them, and 2, it was in a totally different direction than the way I wanted to go. I'm an explorer, but I'm not stupid enough to potentially put myself in a dangerous situation, especially when I am not familiar with what I'm dealing with. I don't have any casting material or any of that stuff with me, nor do I ever carry it because I don't make molds of tracks. This just happened to be tracks that I happened to run into. I ended up going back to my car sometime later, and driving back home I couldn't stop thinking about it. I have a few friends of mine who are close with me that are Bigfoot enthusiasts, so I brought it up with them, and they were ecstatic that I told them about this. Not only did they tell me I ran into Bigfoot footprints, but they also shared with me some of their own hair-raising encounters that they had out in those same woods. You know, at this point, I don't know if Bigfoots really do exist, but I definitely can say that those footprints are pretty unexplainable, and I have no idea what animal made them. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to What Lurks Beneath and leave a comment and a like. All of it helps my channel grow. Keep your eyes peeled for whatlurksbeneath.com coming soon, where you can submit your very own scary story directly to me and have it read on this channel and heard by thousands. We'll be having new merchandise coming soon down the line, as well as a weekly podcast series coming out. Many great things are on the horizon. Stay tuned, fans. Bigfoot encounters. They come in all shapes and sizes. But tonight's special episode features what's known to many residents in the area of Michigan as the Lake Dewey Monster, strongly believed to just be another Bigfoot, or maybe perhaps something more nefarious. This episode features 12 encounters from this area, detailing the beast that lurks in the wilderness and the swamps there. There are a few instances of stories claiming to have sketches and pictures. If you would like to look at this yourself, you can simply go to Google and look for the Lake Dewey Monster sketches, as well as the lake pictures, as stated in the very last story, to get you a better idea of what these people saw. Now, on to the stories. Story 1. On Friday night in late August, several people called into the sheriff's office claiming they had heard a large explosion. One call came in from the 5 Mile Corner store gas station. The other was from a payphone near the same area. The police were dispatched to the area after a brief search located a small glowing fire and billowing smoke. They followed it to an isolated area on Priest Street where they found an overturned car on fire. The car was entirely engulfed in flames. An approach was made for rescue, but no one was seen inside. The fire eventually put out, though the car was burned to the bone. The area was cordoned off while deputies investigated. Eventually, the car was identified to belonging to a man from South Bend, Indiana, who told the police that his brother had borrowed it. Shortly afterward, the police were notified by a local Mildred Whitting-Moore. The 2 teenagers were in her house after being in an accident. Police interviewed the couple, Roy Townsend and Jay Arndt, both from Hillsdale, who were both in shock. They eventually indicated that they had been sitting in their car for some private time when something attacked it. They indicated the auto was pushed forward and then flipped over. They crawled out as something began smashing the vehicle. Mr. Townsend stated that at first they had been hit by another car, but couldn't understand when it appeared to be a thing. Townsend claimed that it was like a bear, but looked like a giant man and began smashing the car. Miss Arndt indicated that Townsend initially took off running and left her there, but then found later as she ran along the road back toward the highway. She indicated that she was still very angry with him, but even more scared that this thing would catch up to them. They stumbled up to the random house of Whitting-Moore, who was very accommodating. At first, the police were skeptical and believed the teenagers were attempting to cover for wrecking the car. However, one of the multi-jurisdictional officers, Gorley Jones, at the scene noticed the tire drag mark ended at a point just over the lip of the hill. Upon further inspection, Officer Jones documented several important things. First, the skid marks continued over the hill, which indicated that the car's wheels were locked and the car was moving at a constantly slow rate of speed as it continued up the small knoll. Secondly, the tread marks were clear and articulated at the pivot point where the car flipped, indicating it had been lifted as opposed to suddenly going airborne. And third, if the car had flipped over as a result of losing control at high rate of speed, it would have gone airborne at the peak of the hill rather than after descent down the slight incline. At the time, the other officers ridiculed Jones. Additionally, his immediate supervisor rendered his observation as irrelevant and that it would lend no particular change in the outcome of things. Townsend and Arndt did not sustain any remarkable physical injuries, but their parting was not amicable. Officer Jones indicated that the next day, in the light of the sun, he searched the area, and he indicated in his report that the brush and grass going to the woods and lake had been obviously disturbed by something. He also indicated he found no footprints, but added that soil is dense with crabgrass or stone to the waterline. An elephant would not leave footprints there. Story 2. On a late September evening in 1962, 4 friends from Chicago were returning to the Twin Lakes cottage their parents had rented for the month. They were coming back from Grand Haven, where they had supposedly gone to see the open of a musical fountain. After approximately a 2-hour drive, they found themselves some 15 minutes away from Twin Lakes, as traveling along the unpaved gravel road of Dewey Lake Street. As they slowed down through a narrow stretch of gravel road that navigated between the swamp on the eastern stretch of Dewey Lake Road, their headlights suddenly fell on what Randy Imes claimed looked like a giant tree growing in the middle of the road. Imes indicated that Terry Jones stopped the car, considering what to do, at which point the tree turned around and looked at them. Jones recalled the animal towered over them standing in the road. Then it just casually walked over and into the swamp on the north side of Dewey Lake Road and disappeared. The girls were screaming so loud, and they did not stop until we got almost back to the cottage, Jones remembered. I was worried about getting past that thing, so I didn't stop, but I do remember seeing that it just walked into the swamp and into the dark. Randy Imes remembers, I really wanted to go back the next day in the daylight, but I have to admit, I was scared to be caught up on that road again if it did show up. Years later, I did go back when we were up there on vacation. The road was paved by then, but it did not make any difference. That place was scary, even in broad daylight. Story 3. On a Sunday night in late September of 1962, 5 children were playing in Glenwood, Michigan. They had finished watching their favorite television shows and gathered together searching for a fabled Luna moth. Around 9 p.m., they were about to break up and go home in preparation for school the next day, when Jamie Shaw took off across Dewey Lake Street in pursuit of what he thought were fireflies. His friend Mark Miller reportedly shouted to him, "Those are no fireflies at this time of the year." Nevertheless, Jamie pursued the embers in the distance into the swamp. The remaining friends continued to play for a while. Eventually, Katie Keene's mother began calling to her. It was time to go home. It was then they realized Jamie had never returned. She remembered, "I asked, 'Where's Jamie?' But no one knew where Jamie was. He never came back from his firefly hunt." At first, no one panicked, but then after calling and searching without finding him, "We told Mrs. Howie and Mrs. Shaw," Katie stated. Soon afterward, the small neighborhood came out and began searching the area with flashlights. Just as Harry Woods, a local, was about to call the police, they found Jamie. He was curled up in a weeded area beside the swamp crying. Katie Keene remembered, "We were scared. We did not know what happened. We thought he had been attacked by someone or was dying or something." Jamie later told a story to his parents. He said he had been attacked by a huge, hairy man who smacked him to the ground and threw him across the street. Jamie Shaw did not go to school for 3 days. When he did, he told his classmates the story of the attack. The school principal later contacted Jamie's father regarding the injuries to his back. Mr. Shaw confirmed to the principal that the scratches on his back were caused from the incident of the previous Sunday night, the same story Jamie had relayed to them. Jamie's teacher, Miss Salee, did say at first she did not believe him. However, after a recess conversation with Jamie, was convinced he was, in fact, attacked by something that threw him around. Salee stated, "I am amazed he was not killed. His bruises were horrendous." Story 4. On Wednesday evening, October 31st, 1962, Betty Garcon was taking the evening train from Detroit, Michigan, back to her home in Chicago, Illinois. The train had already gotten a late start, and as the train approached the Dowagaiak, it slowed to a stop at the remote Dewey Lake Street crossing in Glenwood, Michigan. The train remained there for approximately 15 minutes to investigate debris on the tracks. While looking out the window northwest into the darkness, Miss Garcon reportedly witnessed what appeared to be a faceless tree or giant stump stepping forward from the thick surrounding woods, approaching the tracks. The figure then simply leered at the train motionless for several minutes. Miss Garcon summoned the attention of 2 other passengers, Emily Clark from Chicago and Roger Wentworth from St. Louis, who confirmed the sighting. After a moment, the figure began moving from the tree line toward the caboose of the train, which sat in the darkness on the rural tracks. The consensus was that the figure was about 10 feet tall and weighing between 700 to 1,000 pounds. The hulk then disappeared into the darkness toward the rear of the train. A porter was called. However, at that point, the train once again began moving. A loud metal impact was heard toward the rear of the train and presumed to be the result of a cold start on the rural tracks. The train continued until its eventual stop in Chicago without no further incident. However, after arrival at Union Station, Chicago, departing passengers were drawn to a considerable dent in the end car of the train. Miss Garcon reported what she had seen, along with the 2 other witnesses to the Chicago PD. The rendering of her description as detailed to the CPD sketch artist has become known as the Garcon train sighting sketch, and is widely considered to be the best conception of the monster. The sketch provided as contingency while immediacy of a potential emergency was evaluated. After the initial statements were taken, sketch completed, and situation considered, it was dismissed and referred outside the department. The 1960s were an extremely turbulent time in Chicago, and Miss Garcon reported that the CPD did not take her too seriously. She stated that they informed her that she would need to file a report with the respective city and county or state, as the incident took place outside of their jurisdiction and would not warrant federal involvement. They informed her that they were overwhelmed with real crimes and did not have time to pursue a joint venture monster sighting in Michigan. The case was never further investigated. Story 5. Fitch Camp was a fun year-end activity for the students of Dawagaiak school system. The students would get a break from traditional classes to partake in a more outdoor environment. The parents and students alike enjoyed the Fitch Camp experience as it was a fun way for the kids to participate together in the unique Southwest Michigan geography. Situated amongst the sister lakes, the children were able to engage in a serene environment. After some outdoor races, a group of the kids went to the makeshift archery range. After the exercise, the students were to go directly to the diner at the mess hall. However, two of the girls, Denise McCormick and Janine Fisher, went to retrieve an arrow, which had gone awry. Approximately 1/2 hour later, Denise and Janine showed up late to dinner and sat with their friend Rhonda Burdick and Stacy Ashley. It was at that dinner Denise and Janine confessed to their friends that, while looking for the arrow, they saw a huge, stinky, hairy man staring at them. They told their friends it was really big and just stared at them, so they ran. The story got around, and by the time they went to bed that night, everybody was laughing at them. That is until the cabin in which these same girls were staying was attacked. Stacy Ashley stated that, "Something began smashing the side of the cabin. I thought it was going to smash the wall in." Rhonda Burdick added, "We were all screaming and Janine was thrown out of bed." The camp counselor was not present and later thought to be the one smashing the side of the cabin, attempting to frighten the girls. But the next morning, after washing away what she thought was fake footprints from the mud leading up to the side of the cabin, Susan Howell remarked that she was shocked to notice the side of the cabin had cracks along the foundation. "I immediately wished I had not washed away the footprints." She took Polaroid pictures of the cabin, but was told by another camp director that it did not prove anything. However, some 50 years later, all the girls involved in the incident still stand by the sighting and attack. Story 6. Errol and Sally Cunningham had been married for 32 years. They owned a cottage on Cable Lake and Sister Lakes in Dawagaiak, Michigan. They enjoyed their cottage, but in the late 50s development had accelerated in the area. The couple enjoyed the development as it seemed to progress well with the natural beauty of the lake area. On an early Friday evening in mid-July, they had driven up to their cottage and settled in for a week-long stay. Miss Cunningham had walked out to the backyard overlooking the lake and took in the early evening. She then saw something on the far shore of Cable Lake. Her husband came out and stood beside her. They reportedly noticed an animal on the far shore. Errol Cunningham remarked, "Look at that." Sally Cunningham stared at the thing with her husband. "We were transfixed, mesmerized. We did not know what it was. It was a wild life, but we could not really make out what it was for the distance in the weeds." Sally Cunningham stated, "Then it stood up. She recalled the thing stared as though it were looking at us." She continued, "I don't know what it was. I don't know what was more frightening, seeing that giant animal stand like a man, or the fact that the thing seemed to be looking at us." Errol Cunningham told the Chicago Sun-Times that, "I think we were only curious until it took a step into the lake toward us. Then it was walking into the lake toward us. I got scared and took Sally inside." Mr. Cunningham recalled that inside the house, they began to discuss what they had seen and what they should do about it. Errol told his wife he did not want to call the sheriff over something they thought had been seen and decided to attribute it to the local teenagers playing a prank. Sally and Errol then went to have drinks on their rear porch to relax. But it turned horribly bad when, instead of watching a sunset, they noticed bubbles trailing toward their beach below. It was at this point Errol and Sally went back inside to call the police and to report an oddity. Sally and Errol were consumed in choosing their words to the police as to not seem paranoid. However, as the sun began to set on the lake, Errol recalled, "Sally gasped. I knew something was terribly wrong. She was looking out the beach window. I dropped the phone and ran over and saw it. A large, long-armed thing standing on our beach. It was glistening wet and just staring up at our house. Years later, Sally Cunningham stated, "We ran for the car. Errol backed out and that thing was already standing behind us. Errol drove away, but something was wrong with the car. There was a large bang and scrape, but we kept driving." Sally later claimed that back in Lockport, we stopped to discover the bumper was entirely missing. That thing was some kind of supernatural being. They sold their cottage and never returned after. Initially, neighbors called in to report loud noises, but in follow-up to the Cunninghams refused to discuss the matter. It was only in 1972, after the Cunninghams retired to Florida, did they confess the nature of their departure from southwest Michigan to a former neighbor who still maintained a property there. This was then confirmed by Sheldon Stein doing research on a vacation home circular for Chicago residents. Story 7. R.J. Lutz drew this picture for his friend Harold Underhill. This is a picture of the animal that Lutz encountered when fishing on a very early morning on June 22, 1963, on the south end of Dewey Lake. Lutz was fishing for perch in the pre-dawn darkness when he noticed a large, triangular shape bobbing on the surface of the remote portion of the lake. He slid up closer to it, believing it might be the head of a large snapping turtle. However, as the sunrise illuminated the water, he caught sight of a large log extending from the triangle. He slid up closer to it and became curious when he noticed the log to be a shaggy red. Lutz remarked he had no idea how a cedar tree got in the water and extended his oar to roll the log over. When coming into contact with the log, the thing stood up in the water, revealing a large animal. The animal, which was approximately 10 feet tall, let out an increasingly loud clucking sound, which became so loud it was painful, Lutz recalled. He said the animal then glared at him and then slid back underwater and swam off like a crocodile. Lutz had no idea what the animal was, only that it might be something that was far from home and just didn't belong in Dewey Lake. His friend Harold Underhill recalled laughing at Lutz and accusing him of being a drunk. However, Lutz sketched out the picture for Underhill and maintained the story's validity until he passed away in the early 80s. Story 8. On a hot, muggy evening in late July of 1963, Alan Razek and Bob Ford carried their canoe through the weeds and mud to the water's edge. I thought we were going to get stuck in mud with the canoe on our head. We heard it was a mess there, but we did not realize. Thick, black, deep mud, Bob Ford claimed. But we were told it would be worth it because it was not fished out. Muddy, tired and covered with sticky weeds, they slid the canoe into the water onto the Blackwater. That lake you cannot see anything below the water, Alan Razek told the Cass County Sheriff's Office. A mist had settled over the lake and we expected the fishing to be quite extravagant. It was thick fog like an old horror movie. Even the flashlight would choke out, Ford recalled. We had been on the water for only a few moments when the water splashed, so we sat. We couldn't see a damn thing. Then the boat started rocking. Then again a splash. Bigger, louder. Then we heard a sucking sound, and then a loud roar like an angry animal, Razek stated. We sat there quiet, trying to figure out what the hell was going on or what to do. And then we heard something breathing, like a bull. Moore confirmed and added, we could see something over by the sound, and I could make out a large black shape. We started paddling like hell. Moore and Razek reportedly pulled the canoe out, running back through the weeds, making it back to Moore's truck. They loaded the canoe in a rush, failing to secure it properly. Less than a mile away, the duo had to pull over and clean up the canoe, which had come loose and smashed in the road. Jim Casey had come up on them and on his way home and stated, "It was weird because I just saw this mess in the road. Then I talked to them and it was a weird thing. A couple of tough old birds talking about this thing in Mud Lake," Casey said. "It did make me think twice every time I drove my Mud Lake." Years later, Razek confessed to his daughter that the incident on Mud Lake had been the strangest thing that ever happened to him and told her to stay away from those lakes. Something lives in them. Story 9. It was only one short month after the canoe was destroyed on a road in Twin Lakes, and a monster was reported on Mud Lake, when another canoe was found destroyed. This one on the bottom of shallow water on the south side of Pitcher Lake, but this time its owner went missing. Stan Red Roberts was staying with his friends Philip and his son Roger McPhee. The McPhees had driven down from Lansing, while Red was in town from California. Red had long-standing financial problems, and Philip McPhee later told police he was leery of having Red stay with them, as he said Red always asked to borrow money. After joining them in the rental on the lake, Red and Philip had a few beers. Then, Red decided to take the canoe out on the lake. Philip declined as he planned to turn in early to take his boy fishing at sunrise. Philip went to bed. In the morning, Philip and Roger got in a rowboat and put in. Philip did not see Red or the canoe and thought maybe he had fallen asleep on the lake. I knew they didn't have a motorboat on Pitcher Lake, so I wasn't worried. It's not like a lot can happen out there, Philip had told the police. The fish were not biting, nothing. Not one single bite, Philip recalled. I never saw the lake like that. I got so frustrated about the lack of fish, I just sort of forgot about the whole Red thing. It was only after returning and not seeing the canoe or Red, Philip had become concerned. I have to admit, at first I was afraid Red had stolen some stuff and taken off. But by early afternoon, Philip had become concerned and took his rowboat back out to attempt to find Red. I thought maybe he was over on the other side, bothering some neighbors or something. But Philip recalled he did not even get 100 yards from the shore before he saw the canoe. It was sitting on the bottom of the lake, in the clear shore water at the edge of the lily pads. At first, I was pissed, because I saw a giant hole in the canoe sitting on the bottom, and I thought he probably started drinking with some people he met, and they got crazy. Philip called the sheriff, and a deputy was sent out. They pulled the canoe out. Red, however, was never found. Philip had to pay for the broken canoe. A nearby vacationer helped with the retrieval and then spent the rest of the afternoon looking through the area. Turns out he was a retired Chicago PD detective by the name of Paul Wozniak. He later showed Philip the pieces of the canoe scattered amongst the dense weeds, mud, and trees. It was hard to get to because the water got thin and the weeds got very thick. Not hard enough to walk on and not wet enough to paddle through. An excerpted portion of a letter Wozniak wrote to the Herald Palladium on August 27, 1963, stated the following. The pieces retrieved told me that the hole was created by a singular force blasting up from the bottom, especially as there were not broken pieces directly underneath the canoe, and no pieces caught in the canoe itself, so there is no other way to explain what happened. Philip never heard from Red again. Story 10. Leon Brosnan and Danny Peterson loved to fish. They heard there was great fishing on Gear Lake, but unfortunately there was not a public place to put in. Nevertheless, they were able to get permission to path the boat on early Wednesday after school. Leon and Danny were eager to use their new head-on lures. I remember Leon was laughing at me for using a steel leader on my lure, but I told him I did not want to lose it, and he said that's only for sharks, Danny stated. Leon Brosnan stated that they were using a heavy test line, way too heavy for inland lake fishing, but we always had a fantasy about landing a 25-pound bass, so it was a fun thought. I had no idea it would actually be too light. I still can't believe what happened. I can't believe what I saw. And what Leon saw was this. Danny had tossed his line with the steel leader toward the north edge of the quiet lake. The red and white bobber sat unflinching on the still water. I remember we were kind of getting disappointed. We had worked so hard to get on the lake, and we were getting no bites from anything. No bluegill, no perch, nothing, Danny remembered. We had brought bologna sandwiches with Cokes. I turned around to get the food and was talking to Danny. Then, I saw Danny's face change. My pole jerked and then settled back. Leon went crazy. He just kept saying, "Holy crap!" over and over. His eyes were huge. As it turned out, Danny reeled his line in to discover the steel leader had been bitten through. Leon held up the end of the paddle and told me he saw the mouth come over the bobber, about this big. A mouth as big as the boat paddle had bitten through the line and jerked the canoe before breaking the line. It was a giant mouth that came over the top of the bobber. It was covered in hair, and I swear I saw eyes just before it went back under. Leon confessed later to a DNR representative. Then the DNR guy told us later it was probably a garfish. Leon stated, "I have been fishing my whole life. I have seen garfish. That was no garfish." Danny Peterson later stated, "I wish I had been one to see it, but I just could not get over how it bit through that leader. It must have had razor teeth or vice jaws." Story 11. Elmer Polinick had worked for the National Motors Auto Specialties for well over 20 years before he retired in 1963. He increasingly spent more time in the woods around his house off Griffiths Road in Cassopolis. So, it was of no surprise when neighbors saw him walking through the woods with his green backpack on in the Newton Woods. But it was shocking a short time later when Elmer stopped people from walking toward the Dawagaya Creek. He told the Smith family they needed to call the sheriff. The sheriff was called, and deputies showed up to investigate the reported body found. After investigating the reported discovery, police removed the bones, indicating it was multiple carcasses of deer. However, Elmer Polinick told the police and the witnesses who had gathered that he walked upon a large, red-haired animal weighing as much as a truck, departing the pile of carrion. Elmer said the animal barked at him and then entered the creek walking west. Helen Smith, who spoke with Elmer, stated that she believed what he told them. You cannot fake that kind of reaction. Elmer was a tough guy when he came up the path. He was shaking and sweating. The deputies at the scene reportedly told the witness that the deer carcass would be removed and the woods was open. Nevertheless, the family speaking with Elmer left. Story 12. Davis Garrett had been given a new Nikon camera for his 18th birthday. Photography was his hobby. He had his own in-home darkroom. He was the photographer for all school events and the yearbook. On Halloween, Davis and his 3 friends went to a party at Picture Lake. As the sun began to set, Garrett and his friend Dominic Emery saw a commotion on the west side of the lake. Garrett began to snap pictures. They then saw a large animal throw a log halfway toward them. Garrett and Emery turned and ran back to their gathering. As they made their way back, the thing let out a scream so loud, Emery said it hurt my ears. When they arrived back at the gathering, everyone was quiet because they had heard the noise, Emery said. A bunch of us took flashlights and went over there, but then got terrified. Party's over, Garrett stated. When Garrett developed the pictures, it appears to show a large ape-like creature scaled to about 10 feet tall, strolling the swampy waterline. It has since become known as the Picture Lake Picture. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my content, be sure to leave a like, comment, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be starting to release a lot of content daily, so start to keep your eye out for all sorts of cool stuff coming down the pipeline, such as more Dogman encounters, Mothman, Chupacabra, UFOs, gargoyles, swamp monsters, camping and the middle of nowhere stories, paranormal, black-eyed children, and so much more. Get ready, because this summer is going to terrify you.